Those of us who teach college classes are usually familiar with what I call the surprised student. The surprised student is the student who comes into your office absolutely shocked at having done poorly on an exam. You may have been this surprised student yourself at some point in time. I know I personally have been that student. If you're an instructor, you may have some experience with students like this. Why should a student be surprised at having done poorly on a test? Shouldn't we all have a pretty good sense of how prepared we were going into a test? It's actually not that simple. It's not the case that these students are surprised because they hadn't studied. Very often, these are students who spent countless hours studying and preparing for the test, and who really honestly felt that they were prepared for the test, which is why they're surprised. So what's going on here? Well, very often, when I ask a student in this type of situation what that student had done to prepare for the exam and how that student had gauged their preparedness for the test, very often the response is something along the lines of, I looked at my notes and I reread my notes and I read through the textbook and I reread the textbook, and as I was going through and reading the textbook and as I was going through and rereading my notes, it all seemed to make perfect sense. It felt like it was clicking, and I really felt like I had this stuff. I felt like I was prepared for the test. It turns out this is actually not a good method of gauging your preparedness for the test. In fact, our impressions of our learning while we're right in the midst of reviewing information or looking at the material can often lead us astray. After all, you're looking right at the material, or it's right there in your mind. You're thinking about it currently. So by necessity, if you're looking at the material while you're gauging your preparedness, or if you happen to be thinking about it right at that moment while you're gauging, that material is in a state of heightened accessibility in your mind. If you think about it, while you're looking at the material, that has to be the case. This is not necessarily predictive, however, of how accessible that material is going to be when you're later on in a testing situation and it's not so fresh and you're not able to look at the material. So a better method that my colleagues and I recommend is what we call the delay and test method. So rather than gauging your preparedness for a test while you're looking at the materials, instead close the materials, set them aside for a period of time. Maybe even go do something else for a while and come back to it. But don't reopen your materials. When you come back to it, go ahead and test yourself. See how much information you can retrieve just from your memory alone. Even better, a particular technique that my colleagues and I recommend for students is what we call the letter to grandma exercise. And it's basically like it sounds. You write a letter to your grandma in terms that grandma can understand. So basically, in your own words, try to explain this concept that you're now working on for studying to your grandma in a letter. This exercise is not only a great study exercise in and of itself, as it gives you some retrieval practice to learn with or to learn from, but it will help you to better gauge your preparedness for the test. For example, as you're writing the letter to grandma, note where you're having difficulty. Are there any gaps in your knowledge that you wish you could fill now that you're in the process of writing this letter? Go ahead and write down these gaps so that you can then do a targeted review when you do reopen your notes or when you do reopen your book. Now you're doing a targeted review with what you've identified to be those gaps in your knowledge base. This will dramatically help you to improve both your gauging of your preparedness for the test as well as your preparedness itself. So, the next time you're studying, try the delay and test method. You just may find that you'll be surprised, but this time in a good way. You may be surprised at how well you did on the exam.